Fuller.
One of the primary reasons that a parliament was established was to protect property owners from the excessive claims of the state. Over the last quarter century, this is a duty in which successive parliaments have spectacularly failed to fulfill. Encouraged by benign trends and encouraged by a media with an irrepressible pressure to spend more and take on more responsibilities, and hampered by a globalization of capital that has moved the ownership of property offshore and therefore harder to tax, the political class in this country and this parliament appears to have lost any sense of the responsibility to pay for what you spend. As speakers have said in this debate already, the UK has now the highest peacetime tax burden since World War II. The UK government has direct debts of £2.6 trillion. In addition to that, there are unfunded pension liabilities and other off-balance sheet liabilities that take that total closer to £4.6 trillion. And yet, speaker after speaker, and even in this debate, Madam Deputy Speaker, says, spend more, spend more. Since 2009, the Bank of England has been printing money, and notwithstanding the very clear points of my right honourable friend, the member for Wokingham, that amount of £895 billion of quantitative easing is a potential debasement of the currency. And even though it may have this interest rate, one hand to the other hand, between the Treasury and the Bank of England, there is long-term understanding from capital markets that if governments and sovereigns are quite happily able to print their own money, that those who wish to lend money in the future will ask for a higher interest rate to cover that risk. And the UK governments over the last 30 years have benefited from at least a 30-year decline in the yield curve. And perhaps we've grown used to an expectation that a lender will, in real terms, actually pay for the privilege of funding public expenditure. Now, to me, this is a very precarious financial situation for the UK government. So what are our prospects? Now, the honourable member, the member for Wolverhampton South East, who led for the opposition, talked about economic growth, and the honourable lady, the spokesperson for the SNP, also spoke about growth. Somehow that this was the magic cure, that they had a special plan, that somehow the United Kingdom was doing uniquely poorly. But the truth of the matter is, Madam Deputy Speaker, that economic growth across all of developed OECD countries has declined from an average of 3%, over 3% per annum in the 70s and 80s, to an average of below 2% in the period since 2000. And actually, the relative position of the UK to the OECD position is better now than it was in the 70s and 80s. So the argument that somehow there is something that the UK government is missing in its growth strategy seems to me, that other countries have found, seems to me to be an argument without foundation. I've heard the honourable gentleman, the member for Wolverhampton South East, make this point before, and it's a neat point. That's why I went to check the figures, and I would encourage him to do likewise. Geopolitical risks are growing, partly driven by a 50-year strategy to integrate China economically and politically into the democratic system, which is now at least in question, if not in reverse. And we should think very carefully that disengaging China and its productive capacity from the global trading system risks adding to inflationary pressures. And demand from sovereign borrowers, again amongst all developed countries, has risen from 70% of GDP a few years ago to over 200% of GDP. So that's not just the UK, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is all developed countries. And that level is a level not seen since World War II, and that puts pressure on international global liquidity that again increases expectations that this 30-year decline in yield curves may well go into reverse. And finally, I'm yet to see any evidence that all of us politicians have really learned how to stand up to the constant demands to spend more, involve the government more, as the answer to every single question that the media put to us. And I would only hope that we would pay more attention to those who have to pay for that, rather than to the credit for saying that we can solve every problem. Greater risks, rising interest rates, higher inflation expectations, and a political class that hasn't really focused on the need to pay for things. And that's the context in which we have the Office for Budget Responsibility's Charter, or the Government's Charter for Budget Responsibility. And it is indeed a welcome addition, because it does make some changes which I think start to confront some of these pressures. So there is an additional focus on assessing the affordability of public debt. It's a rather surprise to me that we didn't have that as a focus previously. It's added a cap on investment expenditure of 3% of GDP, and I take a good point of my right honourable friend for working on that. It sounds a bit like reminiscent of the European Union plans, but it does seem to me that there is a problem where you have departments bidding to the Treasury based on some expectations of the, and I'll use the phrase rate of return, but the return they're going to make, and a Treasury having to then stand back and be a barrier against all of those demands on its public purse. And I think the addition of this cap on investment expenditure seems to me to be a prudent addition to make. And we've added a new, or the Charter adds a new key indicator of public sector net worth. And I would again just encourage the Minister to move very quickly to let's have the details on that. I think New Zealand put this together in the last millennium, so it can't be that hard really to put it together, although I do understand that it can be misleading as well as insightful. One thing that's not in the Charter, and I checked, is what are the consequences for breaking fiscal rules? This point has been made by the Honourable Lady, the member for the SNP. There is a, it would be nice, wouldn't it? It is good to write certain rules, but it's also good for there to be consequences for taxpayers, for governments that don't meet those fiscal rules. And that should be more than just a new rewriting of the rules. I would finally just like to make one point about long-term trends in the Bank of England. In the document, on point 320, it says, the Treasury objective in relation to debt management policy is to minimise over the long term the cost of meeting the government's financing needs, taking into account risk, whilst ensuring that debt management policy is consistent with the aims of monetary policy. I like that phrase, over the long term, Madam Deputy Speaker. That sort of hides all sorts of problems. So I thought I'd try and find the long term. So I turned to the December 2020 working paper by the Bank of England, 8 centuries of global real interest rates, to see what that might tell us about their thinking, because I am concerned that the Bank of England has had a view about inflation rates, which was a little bit too benign. In that working paper from actually January 2020, my apologies, Madam Speaker, I quote, against their long-term context, currently depressed sovereign real rates are in fact converging back to historical trend, and suggest that real rates could soon enter permanently negative territory. Ultimately, Madam Deputy Speaker, this is the big question that I'd like to understand from the Minister. Is it the expectation that we are living for the foreseeable future in an era where we anticipate that interest rates in real terms will be negative and declining? Or is that a long-term trend but will be subject to major fluctuations in the short term? Because the livelihoods of households depend much more crucially on that expectation than on other things perhaps we may be debating in the near future.